It's good to be with you again this evening. And Wendy, thank you for those words of invitation and, in a sense, thanks for giving of time. But it really is a pleasure and a privilege. And I know I said yesterday it was almost like being an ordinary minister, and ordinary ministers are better ministers. Maybe I should just have said a normal minister or something like that. But it really is a joy to be able to be with you all, and reassuring that some of you come back again. So that's always a bit relieving on the second go. Hopefully that continues to be so. But whether you're here for the first time or you're here again, it's great to be with you. I just wish that we were all together face to face, and that would enable me to be doing this a little differently from how I'm having to do it. And thank you for listening well last night. And hopefully, although there will be a bit of interaction again, primarily I shall reflect tonight in two sections following the title Rejection and Vindication. For we find ourselves in chapter 12. We won't be studying chapter 13 in particular, but chapter 12 picks up this theme that we can witness throughout the gospel, that Jesus is willing to confront the powers of evil in various ways, the forces of evil, sometimes in nature, sometimes where things have gone wrong between human beings, and at times in the misguidance, the misunderstanding, sometimes the abuse of power that he challenges in the leaders of the day, and not least in the religious leaders of the day. And as we work through Holy Week, so the confrontations come to a head, and ultimately they're going to lead, of course, to betrayal, arrest, to trial, and to crucifixion. We know that. And this evening is the one where perhaps we take a little picture image, a distillation of all the conflict that's going on. But again, we find something to act as a balance, as a counterpoint for that. So we find ourselves in chapter 12, and I've only picked out a few verses tonight because we can't do it all in great detail. And I want in particular to start by looking at this familiar parable of the vineyard. And I wonder, having not given you much notice, but would somebody be willing to read for us? Last night I was having to pick and choose, so I didn't invite anyone because I knew I was doing sort of 3 or 4 verses at a time each time. But if anyone is feeling courageous and has a Bible with them and is willing to open their lungs and to share their voice and unmute themselves, then would you mind reading chapter 12 and verses 1 through to 12? Is anybody willing to do that for us? This will throw Wendy with the spotlight. Any offers?
Peter and Julia. Yeah, Peter, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, our network isn't all that great, so I hope you'll be able to hear us okay. I'm going to read from the New Living Translation version, which may be obviously different from some that the rest of you have. So Jesus tells the parable of the evil farmers. Then Jesus began teaching them with stories. A man planted a vineyard. He built a wall around it, dug a pit for pressing out the grape juice, and built a lookout tower. Then he leased the vineyard to tenant farmers and moved to another country. At the time of the grape harvest, he sent one of his servants to collect his share of the crop. But the farmers grabbed the servant, beat him up, and sent him back empty-handed. The owner then sent another servant, but they insulted him and beat him over the head. The next servant he sent was killed. Others he sent were either beaten or killed, until there was only one left, his son, whom he loved dearly. The owner finally sent him, thinking, surely they will respect my son. But the tenant farmers said to one another, here comes the heir to this estate. Let's kill him and get the estate for ourselves. So they grabbed him and murdered him and threw his body out of the vineyard. What do you suppose the owner of the vineyard will do? Jesus asked. I'll tell you, he will come and kill those farmers and lease the vineyard to others. Didn't you ever read this in the scriptures? The stone that the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing, and it is wonderful to see. The religious leaders wanted to arrest Jesus because they realized he was telling the story against them. They were the wicked farmers, but they were afraid of the crowd, so they left him and went away.
Thank you. We'll mute Peter, then we'll be all right with the sound, won't we? And Peter, thank you ever so much. I was wondering how I could make it weave in the fact you've been obviously shifting or shoveling muck all afternoon, and great that you read for the one about the farmyard, etc., etc. So that was a lovely resonance for us. So thank you ever so much for reading for us. This is familiar to us all. It's sometimes described as one of the clearer allegorical parables. Jesus used parables, these sort of everyday stories or sayings to try to get people to think and engage with, and to speak in language, the everyday language of the street, almost with stories that would be familiar, or landscapes or narratives that might be accessible to people. And sometimes through history, particularly in the early church, there was understanding that these parables could often be interpreted allegorically. In other words, one story was really telling about another story and giving meaning for it. At other times, people have said, no, there's more to the parables than just allegory. And sometimes there's been a resistance to understanding it in that way. But this one probably is fairly clearly allegorical. Let me just ask folk, who do we think are the servants who are sent to try and get the people, the tenants, to actually behave in the vineyard and to give the produce that they're supposed to give, or to pay the rent they're supposed to pay the rent? Who are the thank you, Liz.
The prophets.
Thank you. That's indeed as it often would be. Who are the tenant farmers? Who are the tenants?
The Pharisees.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you for that offer. And it could be the Pharisees, certainly, or more broadly, the religious authorities, the religious leaders. Who is or what is the vineyard?
The world.
I didn't quite catch who said that, but thank you for the world. Or
Marjorie.
Sorry?
Marjorie said the world.
Marjorie, for offering that. Possibly, or sometimes we think a bit more narrowly, maybe Israel. And one of the reasons for doing that is we get analogies in the Old Testament, not least Isaiah chapter 5, where we get the account of the building of or the developing of a vineyard, almost word for word in some way, certainly at the start of this passage, trenching it out and building a watchtower. And the Son, of course, that's the easy bit this far, isn't it? The beloved Son, I don't need to ask, God's own Son. So often we can come to this and think it in those terms. And obviously in the telling of the story, in the rejection of the prophets and the rejection of the Son, Jesus, in the telling of the story, is foretelling a consequence. And in the terms of the story, a violent consequence, a destruction. And as people have looked at this, sometimes they've looked ahead and realized that in AD 70, generation and a half, almost 2 generations after Christ's death, in the rebellion of the Jewish folk at that time, the Romans had enough and sacked the city of Jerusalem. And sometimes in the writing of the Gospels, and as I said, Mark may have been written in the 60s, possibly a little bit later, there could be a reading back of what it was that Jesus may have meant, or sometimes even a reading in to try and draw the connection. The destruction possibly of Jerusalem in AD 70. But more immediately, there's almost a foretelling or a linking to some of the destruction that takes place in just a couple of days' time. And so if we were to move to chapter 15, then we would find at the time of Jesus's crucifixion, a couple of things. We get in verse 38, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And there are a couple of things, as we will know, going on in that. One is in a sense, again, it's symbolic of the destruction of the temple later perhaps, but of the temple life, which at this time in the story of the Jewish people is very much, their religious life is very much focused on the temple, the sacrificial system, the coming up for pilgrimages. It's the center of things, and even that sense of God dwelling there in the temple. And the breaking of the curtain, on the one hand, can be understood to be an ending of that old way of life, that a destruction of that previous understanding and pattern. We also, as we know, that rending of the temple, we can understand as actually Jesus allowing us to have access to God. It doesn't have to go through the mechanics of a sacrificial system, because Jesus himself becomes the sacrifice. It doesn't have to go through almost a legalistic religious process. Each and every one of us can have access directly to God because of Jesus enabling us to do so. So there's something about the ending of an old understanding and an old pattern, and there's something about leading into the new. And we see that in verse 39, when the centurion, the Roman centurion, the Roman soldier who was standing opposite Jesus, standing opposite the cross, saw how he died and said, "This man must have been a son of God." And what we have there is a Gentile, a non-Jew, seeing. Remember how yesterday we talked about being able to see and people not seeing, being blind, and then sometimes beginning to see in a couple of stages, and then blind Bartimaeus seeing absolutely and clearly. Here we have a Gentile seeing as he saw, realizing that Jesus is the Son of God, a Son of God. And that speaks to, if the old dispensation, if God's providence, if God's choice of people had been the Jewish people, now it's moving to the Gentiles. Of course, as we go on in the reflection of the Bible, and not least the thinking of the Apostle Paul, we recognize that it's not Jew or Gentile, it can be both and, that everyone can be included in God's love, that God's love is for all. But here we see, if Jesus tells a story at the beginning of chapter 12, so by the time we get to the crucifixion in chapter 15, we can see the ending of the old and the insight, the sight into the new. And thus, in the telling of the story of the vineyard in chapter 12, in the confrontation, we'll come to that in just a moment, with the leaders of the day, we get the bigger picture of what is happening. That God has chosen a people, that God has entrusted to the people, Israel, the vineyard, and more particularly the leaders of the people, the authorities over the people, their care and well-being, and a responsibility to remember that in the end, the authority, the sovereignty is with God, and to hold all that they hold in trust accountable for God, to give back to God, to use what they have for God's purposes. And they have neglected to do so. And first of all, they've rejected the prophets, and now they even reject the Son, who is killed in the story and thrown out of the vineyard, who is taken outside the city wall and crucified a few days later. And yet, in the telling of the story, there is an indication that, but actually change is going to come, and there's going to be an ending, a destruction of the old ways. So in one sense, that tells us many things. And as said, it fits into this passage, this part of these passages of the Bible at this point, of Mark's Gospel at this point, and of our days of Holy Week, in particular being a confrontation with the authorities, because we had it there in verse 12 that Peter read for us. They saw that the parable was aimed at them and they wanted to arrest him. But they were afraid of the people, so they left him alone and went away. We had that yesterday. They were afraid to do anything at the moment, so they didn't. And one thing we can note in passing, often people don't understand the parables. Remember how I picked up yesterday how Jesus could get frustrated perhaps in his humanity, that the disciples didn't understand, that people didn't understand, that Jesus had to explain more than once. And yet here we've got it that actually it's as plain as day, and not least the leaders understand what's being said. I mean, some have suggested maybe this was a story from earlier in Jesus's life that there's been put here with a particular purpose. Mark's got a particular purpose as to why he's placed it here, in order to make the point that there's confrontation between Jesus and the authorities. Or maybe it happened in the second day of Holy Week. This is one of those things. It doesn't trouble me too much. I hope you aren't too troubled that we don't absolutely know. That whether it's put here for a literary purpose or it's based in historical fact, we're given great insights. We're given an understanding of the deeper meaning when we study the text and pull all these possibilities together, because they enable us to see more than if we simply take it and don't think about it. So I hope that you're encouraged, as I'm always encouraged, when I see different angles and layers to the story. I just want to stay with it a little bit longer before moving on, because one of the things that struck me when I came back to it, well, there were two things, I suppose, that struck me. First of all, a few moments ago, I asked you to think in terms of who might be represented by each participant in the story, or group of participants in the story. And one of the other things I said yesterday, and it's true today as well, is we're invited in ourselves to engage with the story, to try to think ourselves into it, to identify. And of course, we might want to do that in various ways, in the sense of being part of God's providence, part of new Israel, where there's the means for resources to be provided and for things to come to fruition, things to feed us, to feed others. Maybe we sometimes feel that we are people who are messengers of what God has to say, and we, like the prophets before us, are rejected. Or maybe sometimes we need to put ourselves in the shoes of the tenants who turned around and said, no, we're not interested. And then maybe this for us is a reminder too of how ultimately our allegiance, our accountability is due to God, who ultimately has an authority over us. That we are given a freedom by God in the lives that we lead, in the way that, in a sense, God entrusts others to look after the vineyard. We might talk about being participants in God's mission, that God uses us as partners. And there's some wonderful stuff, particularly in the final discourses in John's Gospel, set in Holy Week, and particularly the Last Supper, where Jesus talks about the disciples not being servants but friends. And there's a wonderful way in which God joins us in, but we still have an accountability, not perhaps to misunderstand and to somehow, well, to become slavish in how we respond to our religious and our ethical and our human responsibilities. Because I often think of that lovely exchange between Jesus and the Pharisees, when the disciples have been chewing ears of corn and eating on the Sabbath, and Jesus reminded the Sabbath made for human beings, or human beings made for the Sabbath, that somehow there's a proportion here. But I note in passing, and it's important that we note before we pass on, that we too might sometimes realize that we may need to be identified with the tenants, and also to show our accountability and responsibility to God. And we renew, certainly in the Methodist tradition, we renew that every year in the covenant service, just as we made our promises and commitments in a baptism or in our confirmations. Second thing I wanted to pick up was the bit at the beginning of verse 1. And I don't know whether I'd ever noticed this. In reading from my text, a man planted a vineyard and put a wall around it, hewed out a winepress and built a watchtower. Then he let it out to vine growers and went abroad. This is an absentee landlord, perhaps. And some have speculated whether this fitted the pattern of the time in Palestine, whether there were a number of foreign landlords. And if so, then a more rebellious, zealot-like, pro-Jewish nationalist approach might be to suggest it's perfectly legitimate to resist paying rent, to resist paying a share of the produce, because often vineyards could be let on the basis that a share of the produce was paid over, to resist that in response to a landlord who is absent and not interested. So there's another twist in the story, perhaps, as Jesus is reading it. At the same time, other scholars have come along and said, no, it wasn't the pattern, that there were these socioeconomic circumstances of the time don't suggest that this was a particularly prevalent practice in terms of having lots of foreign landowners, but maybe there was some. Maybe if we run with the allegory and think of the owner of the vineyard as being God, this is saying something about God who might seem to be absent. Think of some of those emotions we had yesterday: sadness, crossness, frustration, disappointment. And are there ever times in our lives when we feel sad, cross, frustrated, disappointed, that God seems to be absent and not present? And if so, do we not recognize that this again was part of Jesus's experience, not least on the cross? Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? First verse of Psalm 22. So in other words, in the twists of the story, as we are asked to grapple and engage, so we see another angle and we realize that this too was part of Jesus's experience, not just that he was beaten up and killed, but he too had a sense of God's absence. And we are left in our religious life, in our life as disciples, sometimes wondering about that, musing, struggling with faith when God seems to be absent. And I want to argue, I want to suggest, taking on the invitation from yesterday of having faith and trusting even when we're not sure, even when God seems to be absent, that God somehow isn't absent but is present, that the sun is there even when it's not shining because there's a cloud or it's nighttime or whatever other analogy or illustration may help. But sometimes it's hard to trust, and yet we're invited to still do so. And whatever happened on the cross. We're going to sing on Good Friday. It's a lovely tune and it's a lovely hymn. I always struggle with the verse and how deep the Father's love when the Father turned his face away, which again is another quotation from a psalm. So it's there in the biblical record, but I can't believe that God really turned God's face away. But Jesus' experience was that that's what Jesus experienced. And the Father, I mean, what was the Father feeling? And I don't think we can talk about somehow God being split apart when we wonder about the Trinity, but sometimes it feels as if that's it. So we are left struggling. And it's here, even tucked away. It's this verse of this part of the narrative of Holy Week. It's all part of the fabric of our discipleship and our theology, our trying to make sense. And we recognize that Jesus trod there before us. And Jesus sought still to trust, just as in some of the other accounts we have Jesus saying, "It is finished, it is completed, it is fulfilled. Into your hands I place my spirit. I commend my spirit. I yield myself up. I give myself to you." The absentee landlord, is that how it feels sometimes? But again, we're invited, as did Christ, to trust and have faith. That brings to the end the first part of what I wanted to say. I've talked about confrontation, and ultimately I'm talking about rejection. That we ourselves feel in the course of our human lives but we can see it absolutely in the story of Jesus. And we can recognize that in all that Jesus was doing, one of the things he was doing was identifying with those who are rejected. Rejection. But then part 2, vindication, to suggest something of what led to that rejection, the essence that was not liked, despised, put out, rejected, exterminated. Somehow something of what led to that is vindicated. And we get a sense of that even in the story a little later in chapter 12 of the widow's mite. So can I again ask somebody else to read for us chapter 12 and verses, just a short one, this one, verses 41 to 44, chapter 12 and verses 41 to 44. Anybody like to do that for us?
I'm happy to.
Thank you. Thanks indeed, Merlin. Thank you.
So this is NIV. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a fraction of a penny. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "I tell you the truth. This poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on."
Thank you, Merlin, for reading that for us. I don't know about you, but I always love this story. It's one of those stories that speaks of humility and gentleness and grace. And don't we give thanks for those who are of this nature and this example amongst us? As I say, Mark is the earliest and often the rawest of all the Gospels, most immediate. We get the rawer Jesus, the rawer sayings, the more human Jesus some of the times. Any of you who's studied Myers-Briggs at all, that emphasis on 4 different characteristics, might know that Mark is often associated with the sensate. So we receive our information, some choose to do that through all our senses, seeing and hearing and feeling. Others to prefer to receive their information through a sense of intuition, of understanding the big picture and having a sense of how it all hangs together. And we can often say John links well to intuition. And then what do we do with that information that we've got through our senses or through our intuition? And all of us do a bit of all of it, but we all tend to have preferences, and the combination is an interesting way of building up to understand how we tend to be like others and not like others some of the time. What do we do with that information? Well, some like to analyze it and think it through and to make decisions based on thinking. And Matthew is the gospel that is particularly connected to thinking, with all the teaching and the way it's organized in slabs all the way through the gospel. But others prefer to make their decisions and would say, well, look, the priority is here. What are the values that are involved? And particularly, what are the feelings and the emotions? And surely, even if something's logical and right, if that's going to hurt somebody, it's better not to hurt their feelings. Others will argue for the logic and the justice because the bigger picture may come into play because of it. So some would choose, though, the other side, the feelings side, and Luke in particular is the gospel that appeals to feelings. And Luke's the gospel where you've got lots of stories of the widow's mite, and that's the gospel which has often got the grace and the gentleness and the care and the inclusion of the outsider brought into the center. Each of our gospels emphasize something. And the reason why I've just said all of that and then gone for a little journey and come to Luke is because Luke in particular perhaps would have emphasized the little bit that comes in the verse before the bit that Merlin just read for us, verse 40. Because in that little bit, at verses 37 and a B, halfway through 37, 38 through to 40, Jesus is again challenging, confronting, Beware of the scribes who love to walk up and down in long robes and be greeted respectfully in the street, to have the chief seats in synagogues and places of honor at feasts. These are people who are pretentious, who like places of honor, who like all the popular esteem or the sense of authority that may come with all of this. But there's a hypocrisy, because are they caring for the weakest? And remember how throughout the dealings, God's dealings with his people, remember how the message so often of the prophets who were rejected was, you must look after the weakest and most vulnerable in your society, the widows, the orphans, the poor, the stranger in the land amongst you, those who are foreigners, those who have come for asylum, those who need safe haven. That's what the people of God were saying to God's people all the way through. And time and again, this is not what people did. And here Jesus is gunning for the scribes and the Pharisees, and not least, not just because of their self-importance, but because some of the time their position and their authority and their power was exercised in abuse of those who were weakest and most vulnerable. Verse 40, those who eat up the property of widows. There's regulations and laws to preserve and protect the well-being and the sustenance in the economic circumstances of the time of the widows, but they take on the property, while for appearance sake they say long prayers. They will receive a sentence all the more severe. So we've just had a little bit where Jesus is saying, and Luke would have perhaps developed this a bit more fully, but here we are in Mark, where Jesus is saying, is drawing attention to those who are vulnerable, who are those who are mistreated. And what's more, one of those who is mistreated, or a representative of that group, is here giving of herself, giving far more generously than those who have much more in terms of what they pay in. She is proportionately giving so much more. She is giving of herself generously. And we know that, again, if we look at this, it identifies, if we choose to let it, with Jesus himself, who first of all is willing to stand with those who are marginalized, those who are abused, those who are excluded, those who are put out, those are exterminated. He stands with those in ultimately the crucifixion. And in a sense, he's standing with them in order to affirm them and to say what you're doing is what I am doing, which is giving of myself. Jesus generously pouring himself out. We get that in Philippians chapter 2. Pouring himself out, emptying himself to death itself. Complete, generous sacrifice. We've talked about confrontation and rejection. Here, we're talking about sacrifice and identifying with those who are rejected or put on the edge. And in drawing attention to the widow who is giving so much, then Jesus is affirming her and affirming and including her, notwithstanding her rejection and marginalization, rejecting her as a group and a class and a representative of that group and class, and affirming what she is doing, pouring herself out. There's a vindication, and that vindication is greater still when we think about what happened on the cross and in resurrection. Jesus was put out. Jesus identified himself so much that he was exterminated and put on the cross. And many of you I know will know this, but when we come to the thinking about the cross, and I don't know about you, but I don't really like thinking about the cross. It's far too shocking and painful for me to really want to let my imagination go there. I remember when I was training for the ministry and we were doing theories of the atonement, we were seeking to understand what the cross might be about. And I remember the lecturer coming in with a 4-inch nail saying, what do you think about this? You know, and it turns our stomachs the minute we start thinking about it. The thing we sometimes don't realize, or we need to be reminded about, it wasn't just, it was a horrible, excruciating death. It was something that was totally shameful, because in the Jewish understanding, to be killed on a pole or on a tree or on a piece of wood was something that was accursed. It was something, because they were a criminal who would have this being done to them, was simply meant that you were accursed. It was not just a painful death, you were accursed by God as well. And we find that in Deuteronomy chapter 21 and verses 22 to 23. When someone is convicted of a crime punishable by death and is executed, you hang him on a tree. His corpse must not remain all night upon the tree. You shall bury him that same day. Anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. You must not defile the land that the Lord your God is giving you for possession. Well, think in the story of Jesus' crucifixion, how they made sure those crucified when the legs were broken, Jesus was already dead, to bring him down and bury him that night, because to be crucified was accursed, and you didn't want to leave them hanging there. You wanted to bury them straight away. Jesus' death was not only excruciating and painful and horrible, and one of the worst types of deaths that there can be, and in that Jesus therefore identified with the worst sort of deaths that there can be, was also accursed. And yet Jesus was raised, and the effect of that was to turn everything upside down and to, in a sense, condemn that which had condemned Jesus. And I don't want to say those who condemned Jesus, because of the possibility of forgiveness. But something that had condemned Jesus was now turned upside down and condemned, just as Jesus's whole being and Jesus's way and Jesus's life that had led to the cross was now vindicated. And we see that in various bits in the way that Paul wrestles with it in particular. So we find it in Galatians 3 and verse 13. Christ brought us freedom from the curse of the law by coming under the curse for our sake. For scripture says, quoting Deuteronomy, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree. But it turns round, and we find that in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 23. We proclaim Christ nailed to the cross. And though this is an offense to Jews and folly to the Gentiles, because the Gentiles would never think that power and success could come through death. That wasn't wise in the ancient world, but it turns round. And Paul goes on, yet to those who are called, Jews and Greeks alike, he is the power of God and the wisdom of God. It's all turned upside down. There's a sense not only that that which was cursed is now vindicated, and that which was previously vindicated is now cursed, but also we join in with that actually we are allowed to participate in it as well. And we've seen that in Jesus's affirmation of the widow, and we see it in other verses that we can find, for example, in Romans chapter 5 and verses 9 to 10. And so we have now been justified by Christ's sacrificial death, so we shall all the more certainly be saved through him from final retribution. For if, when we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more now that we have been reconciled shall we be saved by his life? If before we would have been sharing in death because of what Christ has done, so now we are enabled to share in Christ's life. It's hard to grasp, but the heart of it all is a topsy-turviness, that if Jesus was rejected, and yet God vindicated Jesus through the resurrection, so what Jesus stood for, and those he stood with, and the way of the cross, to shoulder others' burdens, to do all that we were reminded of yesterday, to put others first, to share in the cup of suffering, all those verses 8:31, 9:31, 10:33, and the coupled verses, that this way of the cross is vindicated. by Christ's resurrection. It's really hard to grasp that. I don't just mean intellectually. I mean somehow emotionally and psychologically. And when I was thinking about this, trying to think of an illustration, my mind went to the character of Javert in Victor Hugo's story, or Les Miserables. I don't know whether you've read the novel. Funny if I was reading the novel right at the time when I felt called to candidate for the ministry. I don't know whether there was a connection, but it really was just happening as it went on. I don't know whether you've seen the musical. You may have seen a film or other. I haven't seen the latest one. But you may remember that Javert is the police inspector who hunts down Jean Valjean, who is in a sense, well, one of, but I would argue the central character. Jean Valjean, in the story, stole a loaf of bread to feed his sister's hungry children, for which he was imprisoned. And as he kept on trying to escape, so he ended up in prison for 19 years. And then when he did finally get released, he had to carry the sign to show that he was only on parole, and people shunned him. They wouldn't give him work, food, shelter, till the saintly Bishop of Dean took him in that night. And Jean Valjean, with a hardened heart, because of all of what he had suffered, upped in the night and thought, this man is a fool, he's naive, I'm going to steal the silver that he'd eaten off the table and run away. And he did just that, but he was caught by the police and brought back for the bishop to confirm that Jean Valjean was a thief and had stolen all these belongings. And utter to his surprise, the turning around, the bishop says, no, I gave him these gifts, and my friend, you forgot to take the candlesticks as well. The police were gobsmacked and went away. And Jean Valjean was gobsmacked and wrestled as to what it meant to be given his freedom, to be given his life back again, to be given this priceless silver, as we wrestle with the gift that we are given through the cross and the resurrection. And Jean Valjean decided to lead his life for the good. And from then on, we get some wonderful examples of what Jean Valjean does, giving to others, giving of not just the mite in a sense, but echoing what the widow did with her mite. But Javert is constantly on his case as the policeman trying to hunt him down because he's broken his parole. And for Jean Valjean, the law must stand and cannot be broken. And it's not possible to live outside of the law. And the law has condemned Jean Valjean, and Jean Valjean shall be brought back to justice. Much later, where both are caught up in a rebellion in Paris, they discover the people who are rebelling, on whose side Jean Valjean is, that Javert is a police spy, and thus they're going to execute him. And Jean Valjean asks for Javert to be given to his keeping, and he will see that the sentence is done. And a few minutes later, out of the sight of everybody else, instead of executing Javert, Jean Valjean offers Javert his freedom. And Javert can't get his head round that. How can he make sense of the fact that the one who is condemned under the law, Jean Valjean, or Jesus Christ, has not only somehow found life and goodness and grace, resurrection, we might want to say, but is using that resurrection to set others free. And Javert can't get his head round it. And in the end, he commits suicide because it's too much of a paradox for him to be able to grasp. Although Jean Valjean, all those years earlier, wrestled and could get his head and his being around it and lived true to that decision, temptations as there were along the way. And the Apostle Paul got his head round it. In Galatians chapter 1, I was a Hebrew of the Hebrews. I knew the law. I persecuted the Christians. But in the blinding light of the Damascus rose was turned around and realized that the law was stood on its head and that it was Jesus Christ who was the one who now allowed us access to God and to the forgiveness and the love and the life of God. The one who was rejected was vindicated. And I skipped over it earlier, but it's there in verse 10 of chapter 12. This quotation that we get from Psalm 118 and verse 1, it's picked up elsewhere in the Bible, in various passages. I think Galatians 4:11, Acts 4:11, for example. But we had it earlier this evening. Have you never read this text? The stone which the builders rejected has become the main cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing, and it is wonderful in our eyes. There's a play on the words life and stone, perhaps, in the original Aramaic here. There's also the sense of if the temple were to be destroyed, Jesus is the corner of the new temple that accesses us, that allows us to have access to God. The grace enables us to get there, which we access through faith. And we worship the Father through the Son in the Holy Spirit. Indeed, we worship the Holy Trinity, including Jesus himself, through all of that. The one who was rejected stands with us in our rejection. The one who was vindicated, enabling us also to be vindicated, to be forgiven, to be affirmed in all our endeavours. The one who invites us to trust to the way of the cross, which is the only way that leads to resurrection. Amen. I haven't given you very long tonight to be able to talk through and to come back, but let me, just before we go into final prayers, we got our timings perfect last night, so let me risk us being out by a couple of minutes tonight. Any thoughts or observations that people want to come back on at all? And sometimes we live with, so it's not that I'm giving opportunity, not expecting. And with all of this, what I don't want you to have to go away is hold it all intellectually. I want you to stay with the bit that spoke to you. Intellectually, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. And whether that's in the story, or about the vineyard or the widow's mite, or something about what happens to Jesus there on the cross, may it continue to work in you as you engage with it, and may it continue to bring to you God's love, forgiveness, God's grace, God's life for you now and always. So is Anne going to lead us in our closing devotions? Thank you.